Hi, welcome to Advancement Tech. Just give me a moment and I'll make sure that the stream is set up and working properly. So just looks like a little bit of a delay. Okay, there we go. Looks like it's on and working. So change to here, make sure it changes. All right, so we're broadcasting live on YouTube. If you have, you can feel free to chat. So if you sign into YouTube, you can chat. So we will have live chat going. I will monitor the chat periodically to see if there's any questions. So please feel free to go ahead and ask a question in chat if you have one. All right, so this episode is what is the best size computer monitor? I'm Creston Jamison. This is Advancement Tech episode 14. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome, thank you for attending. I'm going to get a very brief background about myself. We'll have about 15 to 20 minutes of education, although this topic's a little bit shorter, so it may be closer to 10 to 15. There'll be time for a Q&A if you have any questions. And let's get going. Okay, so who am I? Again, my name is Creston Jamison. I've worked at two different universities over 12 years. I oversaw development and advancement services at those universities. Since then, I founded a company and started a product called Advancement Form that does online giving and event registration. Okay, so thinking about the question of what's the best size computer monitor, I said, is bigger always better? Do you always want to get the biggest one? And I actually had this question because I upgraded my computer recently and I was trying to decide, okay, what kind of monitor do I want in terms of mine? All right, so in terms of monitor size considerations, here are some things that kind of I was thinking through that you should probably as well, is that do you have a small or large desk? If you have a small desk, you can't have a large monitor, or you can't have more than one if you wanted to try to do a multi-monitor setup. This is a key thing that you need to think about is how far away will your monitor sit? Because the closer it is, the monitor needs to be smaller. Otherwise, you're going to constantly turning your head trying to see all the items on it. Like having a 27-inch monitor a foot away from your face or your eyes is going to require a constant amount of looking up and down and movement. So just take that into account because that may cause some strain. Another question is, how is your vision? Because depending on the resolution you get, if you have very good eyes, then you can get a high resolution monitor and fit a lot of things on it. If you have poor vision, then maybe you need to get a bigger monitor, but keep its resolution not quite as high so that you can still be able to read everything. So that's a consideration. And then lastly, how powerful is the computer you're going to be pairing this monitor with? In other words, if your computer needs to be powerful enough if you want to try a 4K, what's called a 4K resolution display. So that's just something to keep in mind. Now, first thing I'm going to mention is aspect ratios, because they've kind of in two camps now. Now, early on, like the old square TVs, I call it square-ish. They weren't perfectly square, but like old tube TVs and some of the early monitors were a 4:3 aspect ratio. They were 4 units wide by 3 units vertical. Nowadays, they're typically widescreen, which is like your HD TVs typically are 16:9 ratio. You can find some monitors that are 16:10, but I prefer to stick to the ratios of 16:9 because it's the same as HD TV. So it's kind of more of a standard, I would say. It's not a standard, but there's a lot of movie content and things of that nature are designed for that resolution. So a lot of people are choosing monitors with that ratio. There's also the concept of an ultra wide screen that can be around the aspect ratio of 21:9. So these are super wide that you can put multiple documents on. So that's something if you want to think about or consider instead of trying to do a multi-monitor setup depending on what you're trying to do. Okay, so let's look at some common resolutions that these monitors come in. And basically resolutions is how many pixels across by how many pixels down. So horizontal by vertical number of pixels. So a lot of what you'll see today, except on laptops, they tend to vary a bit more, although they're moving towards a standard as well, is 1920 pixels horizontally by 1080 pixels vertically. Now that is essentially your 1080p. So if you're looking at a TV, that's a 1080p display. And P just means progressive. We can get into that later if there's questions, but it's basically a 1080p resolution. You can find monitors that are 2560 pixels across by 1440 pixels down. That's called a QHD display. Now the reason why it's called Q is because the first HD displays were 720 pixels vertical resolution and about half of this resolution. So essentially those 720p displays, if you put 4 of them together, you get this resolution here. So these are essentially can fit 4 720p displays in, and therefore they called it a Quad HD. The next one you'll find is essentially the 4K displays, and those are 3,840 pixels across by 2,160 pixels up and down, or vertical. Now, I always find this interesting. They called it 4K as opposed to 2K, because if you look here, the 1080, they were using the vertical resolution. They didn't really mention it here. Sometimes they do call it a 1440 display, but they decided not to go with the 2160, and I guess marketing department said, well, this is close to a 4, so let's just call it a 4K display. You can also see that these are called UHD, or ultra high definition is another term you'll see. And then, of course, ultra-wide displays, basically they usually have the same vertical resolution, but just much wider to accommodate a wider screen. So you can find these at 2560 and 3440 and some others, depending upon how wide they are. Now, when you have a higher resolution, it's going to give you greater detail, but each item is going to be smaller. So you can fit more on a higher resolution display, but the consequence of that is usually each object is smaller. So you may need a bigger display to counter that, but then you need to be careful of how you're turning your head and whatnot. But it's just something to keep in mind that yes, you get greater detail, but that also means each thing or item is smaller, like the text may become too small to read easily for you. So just something to keep in mind. Okay, so let's jump into some recommendations. So basically, if you're at about a 2-foot distance, so how far away your monitor is going to be, the sweet spot generally accepted is a 24-inch monitor. You could go down to a 22. 27 may be too much at this distance, but 24 is the sweet spot at essentially a 1080p display. If you try to do a higher resolution, things may be a little bit smaller, but generally this is the sweet spot for keeping things sharp and have everything on the display. Now you can go to a 27, but things will have a little bit less detail, or it'll be a little bit more blocky. You could actually see more of the pixels in the picture, but if you have vision issues, like maybe it's a little bit more difficult for you to see, then this could be advantageous, because then you can be able to have essentially bigger items on the display that make it more readable for you, because if you have vision issues, maybe you can't see the detail anyway. If you're a little bit further away, you can stick with a 27, although at a 2-foot distance, the 27 may start to get too large in terms of having to turn your head up and down to look at everything. So that's a consideration to consider. But if you may want to push, if you're a little bit further away, you may want to consider a 27-inch and go with the Quad HD display. So that's something to potentially think about, because that'll allow you to fit more things on the screen. And with that further distance, you can handle a 27 easier. Again, as long as you can still see the text and everything that you need to do. And if you have something greater than a 2-foot distance to the monitor, you can do 27 or start pushing a little bit further up to go with a 4K display. But the thing you have to consider is that with 4K display, you have to have eyes like a hawk to be able to see everything with a great detail, or you need to adjust the text and actually scale it up so that you can see it clearly on this type of display. And then lastly, again, the consideration with going with a 4K monitor is that do you have a powerful enough computer to drive that display? Again, a current one shouldn't have any problem with it, but if you have an older computer, that's definitely something to take into account. All right, so basically when you're thinking about doing this, it's a balance is how I like to think about it. Larger screen sizes that are closer to you are going to require more head and eye movements, the closer that you sit to it. Therefore, you might need to sit or stand further back from the monitor if you can even do that. And then you may lose some of that screen resolution in doing that, some of the detail. Now, higher resolutions, again, more pixels on the screen, give you more detail, but that means each item tends to be smaller, and it may make text too small to read without you needing to get closer to the display. So it's a balance act. You'll have to figure out what works best for you. Now, what did I do? So I recently upgraded my computer, so what did I choose? So I went with the 24-inch monitor at a 1080p, sitting approximately 2 feet away. That is the sweet spot that I found. I tried a 27-inch monitor, but it was actually, I considered it too big. I literally felt myself having to move back from the computer to be comfortable to look at everything. So for me, I was too close to it to be able to comfortably use a 27-inch monitor at this resolution. So basically, I chose to stick with the 24-inch. Now, maybe if I went with a higher resolution, it wouldn't have been as bad, but I still felt the need to basically step back from it. So like I said here, I could potentially have used a higher resolution like a QHD or 4K, but again, that might have made the text too small for me and require adjustments in the computer to make the text appear larger. So for me, it was just convenient. And these are actually very economical displays, getting a 24-inch and a 1080p monitor. All right, so that's essentially the content for this week. Do you have any questions? So if you have any questions, feel free to type them up in chat. While I see if there's any questions, I'll talk about upcoming shows. So the next show is what is a CDN, or essentially a content delivery network. And we're going to be talking about that next Friday, May the 10th at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So in Advancement Tech, we talk about technology as it relates to nonprofits, fundraising, as well as advancement. So I don't see any questions in the chat, so we'll go ahead and conclude that here. If you want to find more technology shows, again, as they relate to fundraising, advancement, and nonprofits, feel free to check out advtech.tv. And at that site, you can put in your email address, and we'll send you weekly notifications of each episode as they get published, as well as let you know what the next live show is going to be. All right, I don't see any questions at this time, so we'll go ahead and close out. I hope you have a great weekend, and I will see you next Friday.